Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Man of Mystery. One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick's out on the floor of a vacant studio apartment in the rundown apartment building where he lived and worked in northern England. The apartment building was called The Cliff, and it was across the street from the ocean in the coastal town of Seaton Carew. Carl was in the middle of painting the apartment and getting it ready for a new tenant, but he had stopped to eat some lunch and to read a few chapters of one of his favorite spy novels. Carl loved spy novels, and he had a few that he'd just read over and over again. But as he turned the page, something out the window caught his eye. It was his landlady, Darwin, who lived in a big Victorian house right next door. And at this moment, she was standing in front of her house with her two adult sons, Anthony and Mark, and they were all dressed in black, and each were holding a wreath made of flowers. And now Carl felt a little bit like a spy himself as he secretly watched the family of three walk across the street together to this grassy knoll that looked out over the water. Anne and her sons bowed their heads, and Carl could tell they were very likely praying, and then all three of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean. Carl knew that Anne and her sons were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin, who'd actually died in a kayaking accident 2 years ago, basically in the water right out in front of their house. Carl could also see that Anne was visibly shaking, so he knew she must be crying. And when he saw that, Carl himself started to feel sad because Carl cared deeply for Anne. He was not just her handyman and tenant. They had been secretly romantically involved ever since he had moved into the Cliff almost 2 years ago. But Carl had actually known Anne for most of his life and had been in love with her for decades. So Carl and Anne were both from a town that was near Seaton Carew, and Carl had first seen Anne on the school bus in high school, but he hadn't worked up the courage to say hello. Then soon after that, he left to go to college, but he had never stopped thinking about her. After college, Carl had started a family of his own and became a school teacher, but he lost everything after making some really bad real estate investments a few years ago. And his financial troubles had led to legal trouble, and finally, he left his family and got on the run from the police, living in the woods outside of Seattle. And that's when he and Dan had found their way back to each other. One night in a parking lot near his campsite, Carl saw Anne Pullen and Herka looking very upset, and this time he did approach her. It turned out that Anne's husband had only just had his kayaking accident a few weeks earlier, and she was obviously in a very bad place emotionally because of it. She was also desperate for help around the properties that she and her husband had owned together, so that same night, she actually let Carl move into the Cliff. And once Carl moved in, he and Dan began a somewhat unconventional romance. Carl would spend his days working to fix up the apartments inside the Cliff, and then he would spend his nights with Anne in her house. It was weird for both of them to keep their relationship secret, but they both had their reasons. For Carl, he was just afraid of being arrested if anybody knew where he was. He was on the run. And for Anne, she felt like her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow basically forever. So she didn't want to look like she basically immediately moved on from her dead husband. Now, at some point, the two of them hoped that Anne could sell her properties and that they could move far away together and start over. But they both knew that was easier said than done because Carl would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without getting arrested. Now Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street, and he went back to reading his spy novel. And as he read the story, he made mental notes about the plotline and the main character, because Carl was actually working on a plan that maybe would allow him and Dan to start their new life together. And he was actually using all of these spy novels basically as inspiration for this plan. He actually smiled to himself as he thought about how brilliant he was being, and he pictured, that someday in the future an author would likely write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 years for Carl to finally work out his plan, but finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready to put it all into action. On this morning, he walked through the airport near Seaton Carew, trying to act casual as he approached the ticketing counter. He handed his passport to the gate agent and then glanced over his shoulder, looking back to where Anne was. She was standing at the back of the line. She met his eyes, but then quickly sort of looked away because they had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other. When Carl turned back around, he saw the ticketing agent was now staring intently at his passport, and he felt his heart rate begin to pick up. So this passport that Carl was using was a fake. He had created a new identity for himself using the birth and death records of a baby that had been born in the same year as him, which was an idea from the spy novel The Day of the Jackal about an assassin who constantly changes identities. And, if it worked, he and Dan would be able to travel to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was he was going to stay there permanently if he got to Panama, and he hoped that Anne would love it enough that she would eventually move there too. Carl had read a brochure on Panama that called it a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases, which already made him feel right at home. Plus, the country was really cheap compared to the yokai and far away from anyone who knew them, so he thought this was like the perfect place for them to move to. But all of that depended on this fake passport being convincing enough that the ticketing agent didn't say anything. And finally, after what felt like a very long time, the agent looked up from the passport and smiled and handed it back to Carl along with his ticket. Carl had to physically stop himself from literally sighing with relief when this happened, and instead he just, as casually as he could, thanked the agent. And as he walked off, he turned and he sort of winked at Anne, who was still in line. After decades of reading about international spies, Carl kind of felt like one himself, and he liked this feeling a lot. And soon he would be living permanently as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside and in the back of a jeep as a real estate agent drove them through the Panamanian countryside. They sped along the highway into the jungle, and as they did, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a bend in the road, and suddenly they were driving along a sandy beach, and the realtor pulled over and said to get out and take a look and see if this plot of land felt like it could be their new home. So Carl figured that once Anne sold the cliff apartment building that she owned and combined that money with the money Anne had inherited from her husband's life insurance policies, they'd have around £600,000 in savings, which was around 800,000 American dollars. Now that was more than enough money to get set up, but they were going to need some kind of income in Panama as well. And Carl wanted to buy this land in particular in the jungle and use it to open up an eco-lodge resort. Eco-lodges were becoming really popular in Central America, and tourists paid a lot of money to stay in beachside cabins for a week and go canoeing and horseback riding and jungle trekking. Carl also wanted to build a villa on the property for just him and right there on the beach. So he led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed to the tree line on the other side of the bay, and he told her to imagine a row of cabins and a dock for a bunch of canoes and a path that led to a horse stable. And then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to imagine a beautiful seaside villa where the two of them would live. Anne kicked off her sandals and walked into the water, and Carl could tell that she was picturing what their lives might look like here. To Carl, it was like years of careful planning were finally paying off. I mean, this had been like the best week of his relationship with an Everall. They had finally been able to act like a normal couple for the first time. They had gone out in public to dinner every night together and walked down the street holding hands. Carl loved living as John Jones. He felt free and, weirdly enough, despite the fact that his identity was fake, he felt like his old self again, the way he used to feel before he got tangled up with all of his debt. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne said that she was completely taken with Panama and that, yes, she did want to move here with Carl, and that when she got back to England she would get her affairs in order and get ready for this big move. Carl beamed, and their realtor grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the moment that they had decided to change their lives forever. It took another full year for Anne to sell her properties in Seattle and to tell her family that she was moving to Panama, of all places. They had all been shocked at first, but eventually they started to understand that she really needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life. Shortly afterwards, Carl bought a condominium in Panama City so that he and Dan would have a place to live while they built their resort. And then finally, on October 22nd, 2007, Anne moved to Panama permanently. However, when Carl picked her up at the airport that night and drove her to their new home, He had to fake a smile because he had recently discovered some news that was going to throw their new life into jeopardy. And so, he gave it a quick tour of the penthouse apartment and then he asked her to take a seat at the kitchen table. And immediately, Anne sensed something was off and looked very worried. Carl took a deep breath and then he told Anne that he was really excited to build their resort together. But there was one last unexpected obstacle standing in the way of their dreams. He said he had only learned about this obstacle a few weeks ago, and he had been waiting for the right moment for them to talk about it. He had just found out that the Panamanian government had instituted new procedures for anyone moving to Panama from another country, and now English citizens needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police to prove they had no criminal record. Now this was no problem for Anne, but it was a huge problem for Carl because he was living in Panama as John Jones. So if the police looked into his identity, they would quickly learn that John Jones was a fake identity. Anne put her head in her hands and just said, "What are we gonna do?" And Carl said he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised he would figure something out. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne as they window shopped on a busy street in Panama City. And Carl thought about ways that he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in this country illegally because he was done hiding. I mean, the whole point of coming here to Panama was so that he and Dan could live together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop so that she could look at furniture, and as he wandered around the shop, he came across a bookshelf full of old books, including a few spy novels. Now all the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't understand any of them, but he still picked one up and began flipping through it, hoping that maybe it would inspire him. And as he did this, he did feel inspired, but it was not by this book. He remembered the plot line of a different spy novel that he had read over a decade earlier. Even when he had been reading the novel at the time, he had thought that that plot line was too crazy to work in real life. But as they walked around that afternoon, Carl kept coming back to that idea, that plot line, and started to see how he might be able to make that work. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was risky, but he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, December 2nd, 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom, wandering around the West End of London. He did his best to look very confused as he walked through Christmas displays and waited until a store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. And Carl gave her a sort of shy smile and then asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" And when she said it was December, it's Christmas, that's why he pretended to be confused about what day it was and where he was and where he wasn't. And then he asked the clerk for some help. And just like he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern and then escorted him into the nearest police station. And she told the officer at the front desk that something was really wrong with this guy. The officer smiled at Carl and asked what the problem was. And now Carl knew that for his plan to work, he was going to have to give an award-winning acting performance here. And so he kind of scratched at his head and then told the officer that he had lost his whole family. The officer sat up and asked for his name, and for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name, because Carl had realized that the only way to truly feel like his old self in Panama was to actually become his old self and reclaim the old identity that he had left behind. But to reclaim this identity without also reclaiming all his old debt and legal problems was going to require one more huge liar. So Carl explained to the police officer that he knew his name but nothing else about himself because he said he had amnesia. The officer just stared at Carl, obviously dumbfounded. Then he turned and called for his supervisor. From this moment onward, things moved fast, but not in the direction that Carl or anyone else had expected. Carl had believed that if he just claimed he had amnesia, it'd be like wiping the slate clean in England. He could just resume his old name and his old life, and make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial situation with the Eco-Lodge, and he'd be able to get a real passport with his real name and live happily and truly openly in Panama. But this was not what happened, because almost immediately, newspapers caught wind of Carl's story and it made the front page. Because to the rest of the world, Carl had this incredible story. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, never knowing his true identity. And so, almost overnight, Carl became big-time international news. The entire world wanted to know where had he been the past few years. Now, Carl had not expected any of this publicity, so he and Dan were both horrified when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph from an obscure real estate website. And in this picture, Carl can be seen standing with their realtor and beaming with happiness after a day of viewing properties in Paranormal. And this photograph was very, very bad for Carl, because it proved that he had not been wandering around homeless with amnesia in the yokai like he had said to police. But this photo was really bad, really the worst for Anne, because it proved something more shocking and more terrible than regular old financial fraud. This photo revealed a story so outlandish that it sounds like it must have come directly out of a fictional spy novel. Because it would turn out Anne was not the grieving widow she pretended to be, and her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick. Carl's real name, the one he had given that police officer in the yokai when he pretended to have amnesia, was John Darwin, and he was Arwen's dead husband. He and Dan had faked his death in that kayaking accident to escape his debt and so that he and Dan could claim life insurance money. Not even their own kids knew that their father was still alive. Only Anna and, obviously, John did. John and Dan were both soon arrested for fraud and wound up serving more than 3 years in prison. John's very unhappy ending does, in some ways, mirror the ending of the very book The Day of the Jackal, which he used for inspiration. In that book, the assassin does lots of impressive things to change his identity, but in the end, he still gets caught. Our second and final story is called Spoiler Alert. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on October 9th, 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Bologasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station on a remote island in Antarctica. The common room was like the general hangout, multi-purpose area at the station, and Oleg was in there watching TV while his co-worker Sergei sat in a chair nearby reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol and had been for some time, because when they weren't working, there really was not much else to do besides sit around and drink. So Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months. He was part of a 14-person crew that was doing a year-round research stint observing the island's ocean and weather patterns and collecting data for their whole country of Russia. Oleg was primarily in charge of maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which took up most of his time. But there was still quite a bit of downtime which Oleg spent inside, because being outside in Antarctica was generally pretty dangerous. There were hundreds of these lethal deep ice crevices that you could barely see, that if you fell into, you're dead, couldn't get out again, or the fall alone would kill you. Obviously, freezing temperatures, there's lethal violent blizzards. I mean, this is not a place built for people. So Oleg and his co-workers really only went outside when their work required it. Otherwise, they stayed put. But inside any of the various buildings at the station, their entertainment options were limited. I mean, there was just this 2-channel TV set, there was a small gym, there was a nearby church, and there was a library. And at this point, Oleg was pretty much sick of everything. I mean, he was even tired of the library and he loved to read. But the library was really small and he basically read pretty much all the books that were in there. His colleague Sergei, who was sitting right next to him, he loved reading too. And books were something they both spent a lot of time talking about. So, since Oleg wasn't finding anything good to watch on TV and was feeling bored and kind of stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergei wanted to get into one of their deep literary conversations. And so, Oleg turned off the TV and tossed the remote into the chair and took a swig of his drink. And then he glanced over to the corner where Sergei was reading the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read Fight Club. It was about this depressed man with insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts the secret club where people literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had an epic plot twist at the end. And so Oleg walked over and asked what Sergei thought of the book so far, but Sergei just kind of ignored him. But Oleg wasn't surprised. He knew Sergei really well since the two of them had worked very closely together on various research projects over the years. So he knew Sergei was generally a very quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved getting into big, long, passionate discussions. Sometimes, Oleg could get Sergei to open up by asking questions and telling jokes, but today did not seem to be one of those days. Now this was definitely frustrating for Oleg, but he could tell, Sergei wanted to be left alone. So he stood up and left to go find something else to do. Oleg spent some time just kind of wandering around the station, checking research logs and sipping his drink. He thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air, but when he checked the temperature, he saw that it was below freezing, so he decided against it. And so after 3 hours of trying to kill time, Oleg finally just headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3:00 p.m. when Oleg stepped into the dining room feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he'd been drinking. And the first thing he saw when he got inside of there was Sergei. And Sergei was at a table still reading Fight Club, just like he'd been doing earlier in the common room. So Oleg got some food and went over to sit with Sergei and see if now, maybe, he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, Sergei was. When Oleg sat down, Sergei put his book down and looked up, ready to talk, possibly because he'd also had a lot to drink and was feeling kind of chatty. And so the two men began discussing the book Fight Club, and quickly their conversation got really energetic because they were both, drunk and excited about what they were saying. And then Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic point about the book and what it all meant to Oleg. It seemed like everything was going great, but all of a sudden after making this point, Oleg noticed that Sergei had gone really quiet. And Oleg, who could read Sergei well by this point, knew what this meant. Sergei was done talking and wanted some space. So Oleg looked down at his watch. He actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over, and he was about to look up and tell Sergei that he was going to go even check one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergei was gone. And at that same exact moment, a wild scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building, the research station's manager was in his office going through some paperwork when his door suddenly flew open. And when the manager looked up, he saw that one of his employees was standing in the doorway looking completely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide and his breath was ragged, like he was in shock. And when the employee explained why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the employee not to move. He then grabbed his coat and flew out the door into the freezing cold. The manager pulled on his coat as he ran across the ice-backed ground to the building where the cafeteria was, and the whole way, he just felt his panic growing and growing. Because what that employee had just said had never, ever happened at their research station before. He wasn't even sure if it had happened in the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally got to the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside, and immediately he felt sick to his stomach. It would turn out Oleg and Sergei had been co-workers for a long, long time, and they did know each other really well. And what that meant was they knew each other so well that Oleg had sort of learned what specifically really annoyed Sergei. And Oleg used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergei was by violating a serious rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Even if you've never heard the rule explicitly, you don't do this. Every time Sergei would start a new book, Oleg would wait until he got about halfway through and then tell him the ending. This was not just a one-time thing. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly ruined them for Sergei, which always made Sergei really, really mad. And that day in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergei, he didn't just make a great point about Fight Club. He told Sergei how it ended. And don't worry, if you haven't read it or you haven't seen the movie, we are not going to ruin the twist for you, because it is amazing. You should check it out. But Oleg did, and Sergei was very drunk, and, like Oleg, he had also been very restless and tense from having been cooped up in this isolated station for months on end. And so this time when Oleg told him the ending, Sergei completely snapped. He grabbed the knife from the kitchen, walked behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Once Sergei calmed down, he was so shocked by what he'd done that he immediately turned himself into the station's manager. He was then transported back to Russia undrested, but he was eventually acquitted since he had no previous record. Oleg's heart was damaged in the attack, but amazingly, he would survive after being transported to a hospital. On a morning in 2002, a man in Indianapolis, Indiana, woke up in a cold sweat. His hands shook as he tried to block out the images he'd just seen in his sleep. But he knew these horrific images would not just go away on their own. They would keep haunting him until he did something about it. So he got out of bed, walked to his phone, and dialed 911. And when the operator picked up, he said he needed to speak to a detective because he was having dreams that showed him details of a horrific murder that happened back in 1989. The dreams this man claimed to have would help reopen an unsolved murder case that had shocked Indianapolis 13 years earlier. However, these dreams would not answer the questions police had been wrestling with for years, and it would take them another decade to finally track down their killer. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to come trick-or-treating at your house. However, when they do, only give them pennies and dental floss. Okay, let's get into today's story. It 5:0 on November 13th, 1989, 16-year-old Amy Widener woke up coughing in her upstairs bedroom in Indianapolis, Indiana. Amy's throat burned. She glanced over at the clock on her bedside table and saw how early it still was. Now, normally, she would have slept a bit longer before getting up and getting ready for school, but she just kept on coughing. So, she knew she was not going to be able to fall back asleep, and she knew she needed to stay home sick today. Amy heard a knock on her bedroom door and her mother, Gloria, walked inside, holding a 2-year-old little girl in her arms. Her mother said she'd heard Amy coughing, and she wanted to check on her. But Amy barely even heard what her mother was saying. Instead, she was smiling at the little girl. In a big, animated voice, Amy said, "Good morning," and the little girl smiled back, reached out her arms, and said Mimi, which was her name for Amy. This little 2-year-old girl was Amy's daughter. The girl's father was a friend of Amy's who was a couple years older than her, but he had never really played a role in the baby's life. When Amy's daughter was born, Amy had loved her immediately, but she had also been terrified. She had no idea how she was going to raise a child on her own, and she thought her life as a normal teenager was basically over. But Amy's mother, Gloria, had done everything in her power to make sure that didn't happen. Gloria had played a huge part in raising this little girl. In fact, Amy's daughter often called Glory a mom. And Gloria's help, along with the help from some of Amy's teachers, had allowed Amy to not only stay in high school but to thrive. Amy got good grades, she was a cheerleader, she played clarinet in the high school band, and she even tutored other students in French, a language she absolutely loved. She had dreams of going to college someday, and most people who knew her just assumed she would grow up to be a really cool French teacher someday. Back in the bedroom, Amy told her mother there was just no way she could go to school today with her cough. Her mother agreed and told her that she could still take her baby to the babysitter like she usually did during the week, but Amy said to leave her at home. It'd be nice to spend the day with her little girl. Gloria said okay, and then put the little girl on the bed next to Amy, and then she walked out to get ready for work. As tired and sick as Amy felt, she couldn't stop smiling. She loved that her mother had made it possible for her to still just be a teenager most of the time. However, she missed her daughter a lot when she was at school, and so a day like today to be alone with her daughter was really special. While Amy sat and talked to her daughter on the bed, her older brother JP walked in. The siblings were only a year apart, and they were extremely close. They drove to school together every day and ran in the same circle of friends. And this close-knit group of high schoolers spent almost all of their free time together. JP told his sister to get well and said he'd see her when he got home from school. The house remained loud and full of energy for the next couple of hours while Amy's mom got ready for work and her brother and 2 younger sisters got ready for school. But eventually, everybody cleared out and the house became quiet. Amy continued to sit on her bed and just play with her daughter. In a house with 4 school-aged kids and a baby, silence was very rare, so this morning felt extra special. However, that feeling quickly disappeared when Amy heard a door open downstairs. She figured one of her younger sisters must have just forgotten their backpack or something. So Amy cleared her throat and coughed a little, and then called out to see who would come home. A little before noon, a few hours after Amy and the baby had been left alone, Amy's mother, Gloria, pulled her car up to the front of the house. She had called Amy several times from work, but she hadn't gotten an answer. She worried that since Amy was sick, she might have fallen asleep, and she just wanted to make sure Amy and the baby were okay. Gloria got out of her car, rushed up the walkway, unlocked the front door, and walked inside. She called out for Amy, but she didn't hear anything. Then, as she walked through the front room and reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. Amy's little girl was sitting on the landing at the top of the stairs all by herself, and she was crying and she had blood on her pajamas. Gloria instantly ran up the stairs and picked up the baby and held on to her tight, and then she ran through the upstairs hallway and called out for her daughter again, but still didn't get any answer. Gloria reached Amy's bedroom and opened the door. She looked over at the bed and immediately began to scream. That afternoon, not long after Gloria had gotten home, Detective Norman Matthews of the Indianapolis Police Department parked in front of Amy's house and stepped outside. Police had already taped off the property, and Detective Matthews saw forensics officers scouring the front yard for evidence. Matthews also saw a woman standing with several uniformed police officers. The woman was crying, but at the same time, she was gently bouncing a little girl in her arms, doing everything she could to make sure the girl wasn't scared or upset. Matthews put on gloves, ducked under the crime scene tape, and walked into the house through the front door. More forensics officers were busy searching both floors of the house, and one of them pointed Matthews upstairs. Matthews walked up the steps, went down the hall, and into Amy's bedroom. A camera flashed as a forensic photographer took pictures of the scene in the bedroom, while Matthews just stood there inside the doorway staring at the bed. There he saw Amy Widener's lifeless body. Her face and her red hair were bloody. She was naked, and there was blood all over the sheets and on the wall above her. Matthews stepped closer to the body, and he could see cuts and a deep gash on Amy's forehead, and there was bruising on her throat, arms, and legs. The attack on this young woman looked vicious and uncontrolled, which was horrific enough in and of itself. But when Detective Matthews had gotten the call to come to this house, he'd been informed that this attack had taken place while the victim's 2-year-old daughter was present, and that information made this crime seem much, much worse. Detective Matthews met with the forensic officer who was working in the bedroom. The officer told him that amidst the blood on the wall, they had found what looked like a pretty clear palm print. The officer said the forensics team would carve out that section of the wall to make sure the print was preserved in its entirety, in hopes they could eventually find a match in their databases for reference. In 1989, DNA testing was still very much in its early stages, and so it was not being used as an investigative tool by the Indianapolis Police Department. Matthews stepped out of Amy's bedroom and, along with several other police officers, started a full search of the house. The front door had apparently been locked when Gloria had come home to check on Amy and the baby, and there was no sign of forced entry, but Matthews and his team found that the sliding glass door on the back patio was unlocked. He also found that Amy's brother's bedroom looked like it had been ransacked. The dresser drawers were open, and it appeared that some pieces of stereo equipment had been pulled out of the wall and stolen. And so, on the surface, this murder now looked like it could have been the result of a burglary gone wrong. Maybe someone had shown up to rob the place and hurt Amy, or the baby upstairs, and then just attacked and killed Amy like a target of opportunity. But as Matthews and his team combed through the rest of the house, something hit him. No other rooms looked like Amy's brother's room. There were no signs of robbery anywhere else. If this was a robbery gone wrong, Matthews figured that whoever did it must have been familiar with the house. They must have known exactly where that stereo equipment was and had come there specifically to get it. Matthews knew he did have a witness that might be able to identify the intruder, especially if the intruder was someone who had been to the house before. But there was a big problem with this. because that witness was just 2 years old. After Matthews and his team had completed their initial search of the house, he met with Amy's mother, Gloria, outside. Gloria was able to confirm that stereo equipment was missing from her son's room. She also said JP usually kept about $50 in cash in a dresser drawer, but that was gone too. Matthews told Gloria that this information was extremely helpful, but there was something more important that he needed from her. He needed her permission for police to question her granddaughter. The idea of putting her granddaughter through any more stress, after what that little girl had been through that day, made Gloria feel very uneasy. But her daughter had just been brutally murdered, and so she needed the killer to be found and brought to justice. So she agreed to Matthews' request. Gloria and Amy's 2-year-old daughter took a seat on the front porch along with Detective Matthews and a police officer who specialized in working with young kids. And that officer introduced herself to Amy's little girl and then handed her some finger puppets. And then she asked the little girl to use these finger puppets to tell everybody what had happened that morning. And then that officer and the others watched and listened as the little girl used the finger puppets to act out a scene. She made it look like 2 of the puppets were fighting for a little while, and then she said later on, Mimi was laying on the bed. The little girl had said she had tried to lift Mimi up, but then said Mimi was just too heavy. When Gloria heard her granddaughter say this, she just broke down. And Matthews and the other officer tried not to show how much this affected them. The fact that this little girl had clearly seen her mother get murdered was not something they could just shake off. Eventually, the officer who specialized in working with young kids asked the little girl one more question. Did she know the person who had come into Mimi's room? But all the little girl could remember was that the person was strong. Detective Matthews told the little girl what a great job she'd done, and then he asked Gloria if he could speak to her alone for a minute. Gloria told her granddaughter to stay with the police officer and she'd be right back. Then she followed Matthews off the porch. Matthews told her that the fact her son's room was the only room that had been robbed led him to believe that the killer was very likely another young person, who her kids knew, and very likely they knew in advance that the stereo equipment and the $50 would be in JP's room. So, Matthews asked Gloria to come up with a list of names of people who were closest to Amy and JPP. Gloria said that Amy and her brother, JP, hung out with a small group of friends, but she said there was someone outside the group that Matthews should definitely talk to before anybody else, the father of Amy's child, a young man named Tony Abercrombie. And sure enough, the day after the murder, Detective Matthews brought Tony into the station for an interview. Tony was 18 years old, tall with long, wavy brown hair, and he wore jeans and a t-shirt. He looked to Matthews like almost every other teenager in the area. The night before, Matthews had seen Tony giving an impromptu interview about Amy's murder on a local news show, and Matthews didn't really know what to think about that. The reporter had most likely shown up at Tony's house unannounced, and it could be difficult for a young man like Tony to tell a reporter to leave him alone. But there was also the possibility that Tony craved the attention. There were plenty of homicide cases throughout history where the killer went out of their way to get their name in the news. However, Matthews was not ready to jump to any conclusions like that. And now, looking at Tony across the table, he could tell this kid seemed very upset and maybe even a bit scared. Matthews told Tony he was not in any kind of trouble. The police just needed to know some things about his relationship with Amy. Tony nodded and told Matthews he'd been good friends with Amy's brother, JP. That's how he had met Amy. He said they had gone out a few times and then ended up sleeping together, and Amy got pregnant. Tony admitted that the idea of becoming a father at his age scared him, and he was not looking forward to the birth of the baby. However, when the baby was born, Amy and Gloria had basically raised her without him. So Tony said he hadn't talked much to Amy since then, or had anything to do with his child. He told Matthews he'd gotten a phone call from Amy's friend that Amy had been killed on the morning it happened. Tony said he'd felt completely torn up when she had told him, and in fact, he had to leave work because he was so upset. Tony said he might not have seen Amy very much lately, but he still cared about her. And on top of that, she was one of the sweetest people he'd ever met. It didn't make sense that somebody would want to hurt her. Shortly after that, Matthews got Tony's work details and then told him police would follow up if they needed more information. and then he let him go. Matthews needed to see if Tony really had been at work on the morning Amy had been killed. But based on this one interview he had just done, Tony did not seem like the type of person who had done that TV interview to draw attention to himself. Instead, he just seemed like a kid who was very upset that a girl he'd been with unfathered a child with was now gone. In the days immediately following the murder, the investigative team started to look into a range of Amy's friends and classmates, believing the person who broke and unkilled her was most likely someone Amy knew. But based on what he'd seen at Amy's house, Detective Matthews had also developed a new theory. Maybe there hadn't been a break-in at all. Maybe Amy's brother, JP, had killed her and then ransacked his own room to try to throw off the police. So Detective Matthews met with JP multiple times, and in every meeting, JP made it very clear how angry and upset he was that police would even think he could do something like this to his sister. He said he loved Amy maybe more than anybody else in the whole world. They had been so close ever since they were little kids. But despite these multiple interviews and Detective Matthews' continued interest in JP, the detective did not find anything linking him directly to the crime. His fingerprints were all over the house, including inside of Amy's room, but that was expected. He lived there, so it really didn't mean anything. And there was nothing JP did in the aftermath of the murder that added more suspicion to him. In fact, JP just seemed devastated by the loss of his sister. And then on November 17th, so for days after Amy's murder, when Amy's friends and family all gathered together for her funeral, JP shared countless stories about some of the best times he'd spent with his sister. He said because they were so close in age, it was like they weren't just siblings. They were more like really good friends. At the funeral, JP, along with JP and Amy's mutual friend Rodney and some of Amy's girlfriends, did their best to try to console Amy's younger siblings and her mother, Gloria. But it felt like an impossible task because none of them could accept that this had really happened. Following the funeral, Detective Matthews and his team collected the guest book and made a note of everybody at the service who'd signed the book. Many of the guests have been Amy's classmates and her teachers. And so Matthews and his team first met with some of the high school students on the list that they had not already spoken to. But none of these interviews really led anywhere. All of them just sort of ended with the students talking about how much they were going to miss their friend. And at the same time, Matthews still didn't have any real concrete evidence, like any information on the bloody palm print that had been found in Amy's room. So, one afternoon in the week following the murder, Matthews walked down a long hallway lined with lockers at Amy's high school. School was already out, so there were only a handful of students who were still there. Matthews turned down a different hallway with classroom doors on either side and found the French classroom. He walked in and saw Amy's French teacher, Jody George, waiting for him. Matthews had heard from several people that Jody was Amy's favorite teacher. And so he told Jody this, and this immediately made Jody break down into tears. She told the detective that Amy had always been a great student, but the real reason that she and Amy had connected was actually because they both had been raising babies at the same time. Jody's child was born not too long after Amy's daughter had been born. And so Amy and the teacher shared parenting tips with each other and bonded over being new mothers. Matthew's hope was that, in meeting with Jody, perhaps she could point him towards other students who were maybe Amy's friends but who didn't attend the funeral. Detective Matthews ended up getting a list of students that Amy had tutored in French, and he asked Jody if any of these kids might have had a problem with Amy. But Jody said no, not that she knew of. And then over the next several days, as Matthews went down this new list of students, it didn't really go anywhere because, once again, all these students could say was just that they really liked Amy and they couldn't believe she was gone. By the end of November, about 2 weeks after the murder, Matthews felt like he had spoken to every high school kid in town. And he still wasn't any closer to finding Amy's killer. Tony Abercrombie, the father of Amy's daughter, looked like he had a solid alibi, as did her brother JP, who was seen in class by multiple people at the time his sister was killed. And when Matthews finally got the results on that bloody palm print that had been on the wall in Amy's room, it didn't match Tony or JP's prints. It also did not match any of Amy's friends that police had interviewed or any prints in any criminal database. So Matthews felt like he basically had nothing. And now he wondered if HCD been playing it wrong the whole time. Maybe Amy didn't know her killer, and it was just some random stranger that had broken into the house and killed her. And if that was the case, it meant the suspect pool could basically include almost anyone. Matthews and his team continued to follow any potential leads, and they returned to the crime scene to see if there was anything they might have missed. But as 1990 began and several more months passed, it became clear the police had no real suspects. Amy's family still got together with Amy's friends and that French teacher, Jody, to share stories and keep Amy's memory alive. But most of them came to believe that her murder would never be solved. And as even more time went by with no new leads, some members of the investigative team started to feel the same way. And eventually, Detective Matthews and the rest of the investigative team had to focus on new cases. And so Amy's murder case went cold. And it would stay that way for a long time. Fast forward to 2002, so 13 years after Amy's murder, Detective Roger Spurgeon, the lead cold case detective at the Indianapolis Police Department, got a call at his desk. And when he answered, he heard a man's voice, and this man sounded totally afraid. The man told the detective that the previous night he had these horrible dreams about the murder of Amy Widener that had taken place back in 1989. The man said he worked at the school where Amy had gone, so he had known her but not very well. But now, he was having these visceral dreams about her death, and so he felt like he just needed to pass on what he was seeing in these dreams, because he believed maybe it could help police solve the murder, which in turn could make these terrible dreams go away. Detective Spurgeon just sat at his desk, stunned by what he was hearing. Getting bizarre phone calls about old homicide cases was not totally unheard of. Usually they didn't lead to anything, but this man sounded genuinely upset. And so, operating on a hunch, Spurgeon took down notes on these dreams the caller was having. And after the call was over, Spurgeon pulled Amy's case file. The caller's supposed dreams did give a lot of details about Amy's murder, but for the most part, these details had all been covered in the press at the time of Amy's death, or in the years following. Spurgeon figured this caller was not the most dependable source, but he couldn't just let this go. After all, this man could have details about the murder not because he was dreaming it, but because he was involved. And so, the detective dug into this man's background, and he discovered that he did, in fact, work at Amy's high school like he had said. So Spurgeon went to the school and met with several teachers and administrators who knew the callers. And many of them had actually worked at the school when Amy was killed as well. Now during these initial few conversations, nothing really stood out to Spurgeon. But then the school's guidance counselor told Spurgeon something that was really strange. They told him that they knew who the man was who claimed to have these dreams about Amy, and they said this man could not have killed her because on the morning of Amy's murder, that man, the caller, had been working at the school. And the guidance counselor said on the day of the murder, this man, kind of out of nowhere, had this violent episode where he just started screaming and kicking things. In fact, his episode had gotten so bad that eventually the counselor had to help the man out of the school and drive him home. This was definitely a new one for Detective Spurgeon. He'd gotten some strange calls before, but this man's dreams and now his episode on the morning of the murder were something else. Spurgeon followed up with the man who had called him about his dreams, and he even re-interviewed several people who had been connected to the initial murder case. But, just like during the initial investigation, nothing came out of these interviews. After several months of looking into the case again, the detective had nothing new, and so Amy's killer remained unknown and free. And soon her case went cold again, and it would stay that way for almost another decade. On a morning in 2011, so 22 years after Amy's murder, Sergeant Bill Carter, a nuisance and abatement officer with the Indianapolis Police, sat in a small office scrolling through Facebook. A nuisance and abatement officer is a cop who works directly with the fire inspector to check on venues like restaurants and clubs that might be breaking fire code. And so, Sergeant Carter spent a lot of his time looking at Facebook to see if any events or big parties were being talked about that would potentially violate fire code was. Just then, Carter heard a knock on his door. He said to come on in, and he looked up to see a homicide detective standing there. This was definitely weird because Carter had very little interaction with the homicide department. The homicide detective said he was heading up cold cases now, and recently he'd found a Facebook page dedicated to the victim of one of the coldest cases they had, the Amy Widener murder from 1989. Carter said he knew about the case. It had been in the news off and on over the years since it happened, and he had also grown up in the same part of town as Amy. But none of this explained why a homicide detective would be coming to see him about this case. The homicide detective said he wanted to print off everything from this Facebook page dedicated to Amy to add it to the case files, and to cross-check some of the people on the page with people mentioned in the original investigation. The problem was that he and the other homicide detectives didn't know how to print things off of Facebook, so he was hoping Carter could help them. Carter stifled a laugh and said he'd take care of it. The homicide detective walked off, and then Carter quickly found the Facebook page called Remembering Amy Widener. Even though Carter was familiar with the case, seeing photos of Amy as a happy teenager really hit him. And as he read through the comments on the page, he saw how many people were still deeply affected by this murder. It just seemed so wrong that her friends and family had gone this long without any kind of closure. And so, Carter printed out everything from the Facebook page for the homicide detective. But before he did, he sort of read through it all. And as he did, he started to feel like he really needed to do something to help. Over the next several weeks in his free time, Sergeant Carter started to look through the old case files for Amy's murder. Now, normally, homicide detectives would not have wanted an officer from another department anywhere near their files, especially an officer who only dealt with fire codes. But Amy's case had remained unsolved for so long that they figured whatever Carter was doing couldn't hurt. Sergeant Carter regularly checked the Facebook page dedicated to Amy, made notes on the pages he printed, and tried to see if he could connect anything to something in the original case files. He even reached out to several of Amy's friends and family members who'd been interviewed in the past to see if they had any new information to offer. For months, Carter's efforts were much different from the detectives who'd worked the case in the past. No new leads, no new evidence. Carter stuck with it, continuing to work Amy's case whenever he had the time. And on a day in June of 2012, now closing in on 23 years after Amy's murder, Sergeant Carter caught something in the case files that seemed to have gone overlooked for decades. At first, Carter thought he had to be wrong. Maybe he'd been spending so much time with the case, looking at countless pieces of paper and file folders, that he'd just gotten confused or he was delirious or something. But when he looked at what he'd found in the case file again and checked it with the Facebook page and the notes he'd taken from the interviews he'd conducted, he was sure he had found something huge, something that, apparently, no other investigator had noticed. Sergeant Carter looked through the files one more time, found a phone number, grabbed his cell phone, and made a call. And he told the person who answered that he needed to speak to them as soon as possible about Amy's murder. On June 27th, Carter headed over to this person's house to meet them. But when he got there, the person was gone and nobody seemed to know where they went. Soon, Carter found this person had emptied all their bank accounts, quit their job, and just disappeared without a word to anybody. Sergeant Carter couldn't believe it. For the first time in over 20 years, Indianapolis police thought they might be getting closer to solving Amy's murder. But now the person they needed to talk to had fled. And for all Carter knew, this fugitive could be halfway around the world already. A little over a week later, in early July, Carter was at the station with other officers from several departments. A team of Indianapolis police had been working with different agencies to try to track down the fugitive that they believed might be connected to Amy's murder. And now they were waiting to hear anything that might help with their investigation. And luckily for Carter, it didn't take long for him to get what he wanted. And that day, a very excited officer approached Carter and the others and he said, using credit card data, investigators had discovered that the fugitive had rented a car in town. And using that rented car's OnStar security service, they now knew exactly where that car was parked. Carter asked where it was, half expecting it to be on the other side of the country or somewhere across the border. But the officer said that was not the case at all. The rental car was at a house right here in Indianapolis. Minutes later, police cruisers roared down a residential street and pulled up to a house. Carter and the other officers got out of their cars and quickly approached the front door. Right there in the driveway was the fugitive's rental car. As Carter prepared to knock on the door, several other officers around them put their hands on their holsters, ready to draw their weapons. They didn't know if the fugitive was even inside, but they had to be prepared for anything. Once they were ready, Carter knocked on the door. Moments later, a man answered. Carter told the man who they were looking for, and as soon as he did, suddenly there was a scream coming from inside the house. Carter and several other officers bolted inside and they found the fugitive standing there in the kitchen. And there was blood running down from the slash on their wrist, and they were holding a knife to their own throat, threatening to kill themselves if the cops came any closer. Carter and the other officers took a breath and tried to keep everybody calm. Several officers talked to the fugitive, urging them to put the knife down and to get medical help. And slowly, the tension in the room eased a bit, and the fugitive did drop the knife. At that point, officers rushed the fugitive, trying to stop the bleeding from their wrist while making sure the fugitive couldn't hurt themselves or any of the officers or try to make a run for it. An ambulance soon arrived and paramedics sped the fugitive to the hospital with police following closely behind. And luckily, the fugitive got medical help just in time. And later that day, after Carter and other investigators got to meet with the fugitive in the hospital, they finally figured out after more than 20 years who had killed Amy Widener. Based on information from the fugitive's statements, evidence found at the murder scene, and interviews conducted over the course of multiple investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Amy Widener on the morning of November 13, 1989. On that day, just after 7:00 a.m., the killer walked through the first floor of Amy's house. They moved slowly, and in their hand, they gripped a metal pipe. The killer stopped at the bottom of the stairs and listened. They thought they heard someone coughing and maybe some laughter coming from the second floor. The killer walked up the stairs as slowly and quietly as they could, and then crept down a hallway towards Amy's bedroom where they heard the noises. Once they reached the door, they threw it open and they saw Amy sitting up in bed with her little girl. Amy screamed and put her baby down on the floor. Then she climbed out of bed and leapt at the killer. Amy threw her fist at the killer and fought back as hard as she could. As the little girl ran out of the bedroom, the killer wrapped their arms around Amy and shoved her back onto the bed. Amy kept fighting, but the killer raised the metal pipe and struck Amy on the arms and chest, stunning her. And the killer took off Amy's clothes and sexually assaulted her. But, through it all, Amy continued to fight back, constantly slashing at the killer until the killer was bloody. But at some point, the killer managed to steady themselves against the wall. They raised their metal pipe again and they slammed it directly into Amy's forehead. At that point, Amy stopped moving. The strike on her head had killed her. But the killer wanted to be sure she really was dead. So after that, they wrapped their hands around Amy's throat and they strangled her until they knew she had stopped breathing. Then the killer got up and ran out of the room and down the hall, right past Amy's young daughter. Once the killer was back downstairs, they went into JP's room, threw open the dresser drawers, and grabbed the $50 out of one of them. After pocketing the money, they picked up some stereo equipment and then ran out of the house through the sliding door that led onto the back porch. As the killer ran away, they just hoped nobody had seen them and that maybe they would get away with the horrific act they had just committed against their best friend's sister. Rodney Dank, who was JP's best friend and who would remain close to the family following Amy's murder, had been Amy's killer. It turned out he was able to get away with this crime for over 20 years simply because of an oversight. Initially, the police had Rodney listed as one of Amy's close friends that they would need to interview, but for some reason nobody ever spoke to him. Rodney did not get questioned in the initial investigation or in the secondary investigation when that man had called in to tell police about his dreams. This oversight was what Sergeant Carter, the nuisance and abatement officer, noticed when he started digging into Amy's case in his spare time. He saw Rodney's name listed in the guest book from Amy's funeral, and then he found Rodney mentioned in other notes from the investigation. But he didn't see any record of Rodney ever being interviewed. So Carter tracked Rodney down and set up a meeting with him. At the time, Carter did not have any idea if Rodney had a connection to the murder or if he could even offer any information. He just wanted to speak to Rodney because nobody ever had. But when Carter went to meet Rodney and realized he had fled, that immediately made Rodney the first major suspect the police had in the case into decades. After police finally caught up to Rodney, they discovered that his palm print matched the bloody print found in Amy's room. And while Rodney was recovering in the hospital, he would confess to what he did to Amy. However, in his confession, he did not make it clear if he had gone to the house with that intent, or if he had simply gone there to rob his best friend, JP, and then she had been a target of opportunity. It was also never clear if the man who had called the police in 2000 really experienced those dreams that supposedly showed Amy's murder. And police also don't know what caused that man's violent episode on the day Amy died. However, they do know that that particular man who called in about his dreams had absolutely no involvement in Amy's death. Ultimately, Rodney Dank was sentenced to 65 years in prison. Sergeant Carter was named Investigator of the Year by the Indianapolis Police Department based on his work on this case. As for Amy's daughter, she was raised by Amy's mother, Gloria, and when she reached high school, she actually had Jody George, Amy's favorite teacher, for French Joe. And when she graduated, Jody would tell her, "I just remember so many things about your mother and how your mother felt about you. And I know your mother would be so proud of you right now." A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.